Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron Hubble, and I am the co-chair of ISPE Boston Chapter's Educational Programs Committee. It is now 12 noon, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, the Pharma Community Rallies, Meeting the Challenges of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our program sponsors, DPS Group, ICQ Consultants, and Massey Bioservices. In this time of social distancing, with in-person events being impossible, we are producing a series of high-quality webinars such as this one. Upcoming events include a webinar discussing all things water and water systems with Brian Hagopian on May 7th, and a conversation with Dr. Jeff Baker from the FDA on May 21st. Brian is deeply experienced with high-purity water systems, so if you are looking for information on water systems, then don't miss his talk on the 7th. And I can promise you that Baker's talk will be a don't miss webinar as well. He's an incredibly knowledgeable and entertaining speaker. Programs such as this are only possible with the support of a dedicated volunteer network. The Educational Programs Committee's mission is to provide relevant, high-quality content to our membership, and we need volunteer support. Volunteering with the Educational Programs Committee is an opportunity to build your professional network by helping plan presentations, deliver panel discussions, and plant tours covering a range of topics, including the marquee annual Boston Product Show. If you're interested in getting involved, you can reach out to us at our chapter website, ispeboston.org. Next, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you're listening to this event using your computer's speaker by default, if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All attendees are muted by default. You have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the Q&A session on Pigeonhole. A link to the Q&A platform has been provided in your confirmation email, as well as into the GoToWebinar chat box. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, as well as vote on questions which are submitted by others. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If we don't get to every question by 1 o'clock, we will follow up with an answer by email. And we will also follow up with a survey at the conclusion of the webinar. I'd now like to introduce our speakers. We have Steve Fadden, PE, Senior Director of Technical Operations at J&J, Georgia Caresti, PhD and MPH, who is the R&D Chief Operating Officer at Takeda, and finally, Mark Pelletier, PhD, who's the Director of Process Technology with CRB Consulting Engineers. Thank you, Steve, Georgia, and Mark. And for now, we will begin our panel discussion. So thank you all for joining us. So I'd like to start out with a general question to all of you. And perhaps, Georgia, we start with you, and then we'll move to Steve and then Mark. So when did you first identify the COVID-19 pandemic as an issue with which your firm should get involved? And how did your firm's COVID-19 actions and programs begin moving?
Thank you, Aaron. Hi, everyone. As you probably know, Takeda is a Japanese company. And as such, we have a very long and a large presence, not only in Japan, but in Asia. Very early in January, we had received notification from our development organization based in Shanghai that there were some concerns with an ongoing health issue. It was part of our effort to look regionally across our development operating model, with Asia being a region, Japan being a region, Europe being a region, and the US being a region, so 4 regions. And Asia, primarily China, raised their hand first and highlighted this issue. Being an R&D organization and recognizing what our responsibilities are not just in developing products, but ensuring the safety of patients in our clinical trials, we immediately put in place a plan, first and foremost, to keep our employees safe. Secondly, to keep patients in our trials safe. And then third, ensure uninterrupted clinical trial supply to the ongoing studies that we had in China to ensure there was no interruption in therapy. Little did we know in early January that we would then use that same model to apply next to our development office in Japan, then in China, then in the US. So we used the learnings from China to roll into the other regions. So we had a consistent model with how we protected employees, patients, and then ensured uninterrupted supply. We continue to look to China as China has pivoted and begun returning to a more routine way of doing R&D business. Patients are returning to trial sites, and we are learning what we may be able to do in the other regions.
Okay, I'll go next. Hi, everybody. So I guess, I watched the news and saw it and didn't give it a lot of thought. You see it in January until our chief scientific officer, Paul Stoffels, kind of announced that they were going to start working on the vaccine. And again, that seemed like the right thing to do. And then until, I guess for me, Saturday morning in February, one of my old bosses called up, who runs our supply chain, said, "What do you think we should do about this?" And from then on, we've been struggling and really working to get a supply chain in place to address this. And we're still in the midst of that at the moment to try and get to the numbers that we think we need to get to, which is quite large. So that's kind of where my story goes, and we're in the midst of that at the moment.
I guess I'll follow up. Mine, there's two versions actually. Mine was on the personal side. I was expecting some goods from China in January, and suddenly they were all interrupted in their delivery to me, and it was like, what's going on? To the point that I was actually looking at the economic side of it and said, hey, wait a minute, if China shuts down, the rest of the world could be affected very quickly. And obviously I didn't touch my money and lost a lot of it over the craziness. But on the professional side, as early as February, CRB started looking at this, and CRB has been involved in the design and construction of a lot of these biopharmaceutical facilities, and I personally had been involved in 4 BARDA projects for pandemic, flu, etc. And my first call actually in February was to BARDA and asked them, what's going on, and is there something that we could help you with? And the first answer that I got was a company like CRB can't work directly with BARDA. We have to go through channels, and the channels are using the end users, the manufacturers of vaccines, etc., or working through some of the consultants that they already had in their partnerships. Also, CRB created a COVID-19 task group, and we've been meeting every week trying to figure out how can we best help the industry at this point. And the early discussions were there's going to be a lot of companies coming up with some novel vaccine potentials, and as we know, there's, I think as of April 15th, there are 86 vaccine candidates that are out there right now going into phase 1 clinical and being evaluated. So the question was, well, how could we quickly mobilize to build a facility? We were thinking single-use systems, etc. But really, that wasn't the answer as far as I was concerned, and a few others on my team were concerned. It was like, there's just no time. I mean, we can't wait. The traditional, design construction of a facility is a minimum of 2 years by the time it's validated and licensed by the FDA, and we just don't have 2 years at this point. So we had to have something that was more readily available. So what we started looking into is existing facilities, and not just in the vaccine world, but also, for instance, in the monoclonal antibody world. There's a lot of capacity in those areas, and many of the vaccines, especially, for instance, the subunit vaccines that we talk about, use technologies that are very consistent with monoclonal antibody production. So part of our effort was to look and see at the existing capacity in all bioprocessing and say, well, which of those bioprocesses could lend themselves to subunit vaccine manufacturing. So that's kind of where we dove into it. And we're in April now, and we're looking at it through different perspectives and through different lenses. And we're looking at a variety of potentials here.
Mark, let me just add one other point to that, because you bring up a good example of repurposing. And what the industry has been doing from an R&D point of view is looking to repurpose existing therapies to see if they could be used for COVID-19. Many of the antiretrovirals have been explored around can they be used. And interestingly, one of the very big businesses at Takeda is a plasma business. And Takeda formed an alliance with CSL Behring to develop a potential plasma-derived therapy for treating COVID-19. The alliance began immediately and has the plans to develop one unbranded product for that therapy. The interesting thing is it requires plasma donations from many individuals who have fully recovered from COVID-19. That blood is then processed, antibodies are removed, and that convalescent plasma is then used to treat the most serious patients. I'm very proud, not just of Takeda, but of the whole industry, to take this approach, not by individual company, but by an alliance, to come together to see if there was something that 4 or 5 or 6 different companies could contribute to come forward with a possible therapy.
Just to follow on to another one of Mark's comments here, the timing here has been key. We've really gone out and looked for partners and CMOs that have some sort of existing capacity that can be easily rectified and changed over to this. And that's been, we've had some successes there, but given the amount of material needed, of doses needed, we're struggling. But we've found some, and we're continuing that search for more. But it really is not a design build kind of situation. It's a kind of find what's out there.
It's such a great point, and the repurposing is excellent comment, and I'll follow up on that one. Is so people probably know me in the industry through my participation on the ISB baseline guideline and close processing as an example. And one of the elements in that close processing formula are risk assessments and assessing whether your process is closed and if it's fit for purpose. And I have conducted in the last 2 months alone, I think 4 or 5 risk assessments that are all looking at exactly what we're talking about right now. Is so if I was to repurpose this facility, a good example is a lot of the host cells that we'd be using for vaccine manufacturing, et cetera, would use, for instance, a HEC293 cell as a host cell, and that automatically puts you in a BSL2. We have infectious areas that need to be segregated from non-infectious areas. So it's not just a question of product protection anymore. It's a question of facility containment and making sure that the right operations are contained within very specific zones of the building. And so I've been performing risk assessments for a series of CMOs, Steve, probably some of the people that you're talking to right now, in terms of would I be able to adapt my facility for so-and-so's process? And one of the companies that I'm working with, I can't name them, unfortunately, but this company has had requests from 4 or 5 different entities using very, very different approaches to vaccine manufacturing. And so the risk assessment on one company has been performed 3 times based on the potential of a certain platform being introduced to a facility that it really wasn't originally designed for.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of requests coming out there, not just from us, but from a lot of different companies for these. As we discuss it, we're working with some, and hopefully will be announced shortly. But I know every week that they announce another collaboration that they're doing with somebody else, and we have to call up and go, "You're still counting on us, right?" And they say, "Yes, we're still counting on you," but they've got these others. So it's been very busy and very competitive.
It has been.
Okay, thank you. This is Aaron. I had a minor technical difficulty where my home internet crashed just as Georgia started talking, but I'm back in now, so my apologies for any hiccups
We don't have
that
to start over, do we?
that occurred there. No, 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 no.
We're
It
good.
just kicked me out. So we'll move back into the swing of things. So thank you for those answers. Um, so question one, has the recent push for speed to market of COVID-19 vaccines affected the behavior of the FDA or other regulatory agencies toward accelerating approvals for vaccines and other treatments? Also approvals for alternative medical equipment around diagnostics and PPE. I know, Mark, you and I had spoken about this just the other night. Maybe we could start off with your thoughts on have the regulatory agencies responded with a similar level of speed for alternative approval mechanisms that correspond to the speed with which the industry has been responding?
Yeah, I mean, they've been providing opportunities for emergency use only type applications that have come in. As an example, one of the things that's a little dear to my heart is the N95 mask repurposing or reuse through a decontamination process. And there's some applications that have been made there. And as we know, Battelle was just awarded a pretty significant amount of money to provide pods that would reside in specific areas, starting with New York, in an ability to decontaminate masks that had been used previously and were potentially contaminated, obviously, with COVID-19. And what we're seeing from the FDA is that those are being issued very, very quickly. In fact, I was one of the first people curious about the hydroxychloroquine and had started looking into it in terms of some of the, I'd say, moderately scientific clinical trials that have been taking place. And I'd seen that for clinical trials in Minnesota, Pittsburgh, et cetera, where they were going to evaluate it, the FDA granted them permission to move ahead with these clinical trials very, very quickly again. So, and that's something you typically don't see.
Let me come at this answer maybe from a little bit of a different approach, and starting with what the mission of the FDA is. The mission of the FDA is to ensure that they protect the public health by ensuring safety, efficacy, security of drug products, devices. So it's in their best interest. It's part of their mission to ensure that they work with companies and bring therapies to the market. Now, the examples that Mark gave are absolutely appropriate. It doesn't relieve FDA of their responsibility, but it does give them flexibility to approach it in unique and maybe creative ways. And so, I'm seeing the same thing in terms of their willingness to work with the Alliance on this plasma-derived therapy. They've been more than willing to accommodate meetings and bring forward ideas as to how the company and the Alliance might choose to approach this. And so I don't think it's anything unique, but I do think that this crisis has given FDA and other health authorities around the world, the platform to be creative. The interesting thing is, by progressing the plasma-derived therapy, there are many countries who do not allow plasma or blood collection for use in the therapies that we are considering. And so it's a whole different way of working within the health infrastructure in order to progress products. So I fully agree with Mark that it has been very reassuring to see how the FDA and other global health authorities have partnered again to meet their mission.
And I think from our standpoint, there's been several, not only the vaccine that we're working with, but several of our existing monoclonal antibody products have been identified as potentials. And I think there's been a lot of flexibility from the FDA on getting trials started very quickly on that. So they've shown a lot of flexibility there. And then with the vaccines with BARDA, we see them trying to work with the various agencies in the government to open doors, get meetings set up, and to also to provide funding for development, as has been announced before.
It's funny, I've had some discussions with BARDA. As I said, I had participated in 4 projects for BARDA about a decade ago, and And now they're kind of resurfaced. And when you speak to the people from BARDA, they still think the FDA is running too slowly. And it was kind of their reaction. So, and this is in a call just a couple of weeks ago. It's quite interesting.
You know, Steve, I want to touch on one other point you made about the need to get trials started quickly. And what I'm seeing, and what, again, the industry as a whole has stepped up to do, is in the clinical trial space. Every single company has looked at the ongoing trials they have globally and have made some difficult decisions to either pause some trials, stop some trials, still progress critical trials. And what that does is that does two things for the environment. One, it doesn't overburden the healthcare infrastructure that needs to be available to run these clinical trials for COVID therapies. That's first and foremost. Second, it doesn't burden the companies who need to now run clinical trials for COVID and also maintain trials that are underway. So I think, once again, the industry has been very, very thoughtful to create space to relieve the burden on the healthcare infrastructure. So companies, CROs, are ready to work with a health authority for an expedited trial. So, again, I applaud the industry for how they've approached creating that additional space and capacity for when those trials are ready to go.
Right, it's always a question of risk too, and some of the vaccines that we manufacture. I mean, we make 5 billion vaccines a year in the world, 1.5 billion to flu vaccine, and the 1.5 billion flu vaccines that we make per year are based on 3-4 technologies, platforms. And so the risk, when you think about it, for clinical trials using one of those platforms, is actually quite small. And I bet you could get a team of people that would be willing to come into as candidates for clinical trials at this point. Using those like I'm thinking of a subunit vaccine using baculovirus as an example. I mean, that's a pretty proven technology, very, very low risk. You're not administering a live virus. I mean, the risks are infinitesimally small, and so I think those provide the better candidates, if you want, for clinical trials for today.
Great, thank you. So we're hearing a lot about collaborations across companies. Sanofi and GSK have been in the news recently. Are those coming together organically, or are those more driven at the corporate level, at the C-level office?
I'll speak first. We're working with a partner to try and get a joint venture, a joint approach in the Asia Pacific area to try and get our vaccines jointly developed into that area quickly. And that was driven from above. I think there was a lot of personal interaction. Again, our chief scientific officer, Paul Stoffels, has contacts everywhere, it would seem, and so he's been making those, and then very quickly we're able to capitalize on that and begin those discussions and get the groups together very quickly. So we've been able to do that, and although they're not complete, of course, but just the speed at which they've come together and the progress made really has been quite good. But it's very much assisted by the interactions at that level. That's what I've seen.
I agree, Steve, and let's admit the industry is a pretty small space, right? A lot of people know one another, have worked together. You and I worked together at Centocor many years ago, and those relationships and those interactions help foster the partnerships that need to take place. Those conversations are happening at all levels of the company, in the C-suite, scientifically, medically, from a capabilities point of view. So I do think that bringing all those pieces together are happening efficiently and are being driven by this crisis. But it may also establish some working norms that we could carry forward. Once the crisis is over, having demonstrated that this might be the most efficient and effective way to bring, new and needed therapies forward.
Yeah, I think that would be a really good outcome if the
Mm-hmm.
partnerships that form now could really then continue to grow and strengthen to serve the people better. So that would be great.
Exactly.
So I work on the bioforum, and I probably spend 5 to 10 hours a week on the bioforum, and all of you are represented on the bioforum.
Mm-hmm.
And I am amazed, I'd say, over the last 5 years at the level of collaboration and interaction that takes place. Things that 5, 10 years ago would have been considered trade secrets. We wouldn't talk about it, we wouldn't disclose it, are being fully disclosed in terms of how do we improve the industry, and how do we make our drugs safer, for one, and how do we achieve our goals in a more efficient way, and how do we get to a consensus, because I think the importance in the industry, when we talk about the ASME BPE, when we talk about the ISP, when we talk about the bioforum, there's 3 magic words, and it's voluntary consensus standard. And if we start talking and sharing our ideas of what are the best practices in terms of drug manufacturing, equipment design, facility design, and we work together in this voluntary consensus way, that's a very, very powerful tool when we do talk to our regulators and we talk to the FDA, the EMA, et cetera, and we share these ideas with them and say, hey, we all agree this is the best way to do it.
Right. And that has already been underway in the R&D space for years. Trendcelerate has been the place where those consensus standards have been put in place, whether it's advanced risk-based monitoring for clinical trials, or how we approach other aspects of drug development. And so we've shown that it can be effective and efficient if it drives down the cost to develop a new therapy, the amount of time to develop a new therapy. That's paying for itself, while no one is losing out when it comes to those shared opportunities. We all work under the same GXPs, no matter what company you are. We're all working under the same, so let's take advantage of that.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I agree that the collaboration side is a big place to move forward. I've been involved with BPOG on a number of their work streams, and I think that is going to be a change to some of our ways of working in terms of moving forward in a post-pandemic world. I'm curious, what other changes might we see in terms of ways of working, how we innovate, how we commercialize, lessons that we're going to be learning that we're learning in real time right now that we can apply going forward. I know, Steve, you're doing a lot of work in supply chain right now. Are there lessons that you see now that you're learning that we could apply moving forward?
It's hard to say what lessons we're learning right now. We're right in the midst of it. I think, when you look at the numbers, when we, for us in our monoclonal antibody business and things where we talk about 10 million doses a year and things like that, and Mark was mentioning, billions, it's a big change. It's a step change in how to approach that. When we've looked at, can we go back to the point where we modify our existing platforms? We still have to supply those other medicines, right? We can't short people, and switch capacity. We've got to keep our patients supplied plus meet the pandemic. And so I think we're struggling to learn those lessons. I think ask me in 6 months, and I'll hopefully have a great message and a great lessons learned. But we're in the midst of learning those now. We're leveraging other pharmaceutical companies. We're leveraging CMOs to try and get those things in place and how to do that quickly. But right now, for us at least, I think we're right in the thick of it, and I don't have the 2020 vision yet to come back and say, here's the lessons that we've learned. There's a lot of challenges. These are big numbers, and then so apologies, but maybe 6 months from now we'll be able to share some good lessons.
Yeah, the only one that I would ask, I guess, is what happened to BARDA? So a decade ago, I mean, as I said, I worked on 4 BARDA projects, and the rule was in 6 months you have to have 50 million doses coming out of your shop. And within announcement, in this case, it was what, January 10th, January 10th, I think, is when they published the COVID-19. So the clock should have started there, and 6 months later, the companies that had been funded by BARDA were supposed to have a mobilization plan. You know, that doesn't answer all the other issues that are happening, but in terms of vaccine manufacturing, we were supposed to have a methodology to get us to a vaccine within 6 months, and for some reason that hasn't been in the news, and I'm curious, whatever happened to that? Most of those companies don't exist anymore. They were, so they exist, the facilities exist, but they were acquired by someone else, Texas A&M, Novartis, Securus, and all these companies. Protein Sciences is now Sanofi, et cetera, et cetera. So the people that have been awarded the money don't exist anymore. And Novavax, I guess, is still there. But my question is, so whatever happened to that mandate?
You know, Mark, I can't answer that question, but I do want to just make one point about, you know, what's going to be expected of the industry when those vaccines are produced, and that's going to be access, not just for this vaccine for this pandemic, but going forward, what's going to be expected of our industry is access for every single person on the planet. It isn't going to be acceptable to say that only certain countries can afford that vaccine, or only certain regions have the infrastructure to store and dispense and the like. So I do think what's going to be expected of our industry is going to be much more sensitivity to ensuring that what we develop has a price point that can ensure access for everyone who needs it. And so I do think that's going to come out of this, because if that vaccine is developed, this is a global pandemic. Every single country and the health authority in every single country and every single government is going to be expecting it for their citizens. And the industry is going to have to be able to make that available. We don't want to go down the same path we did with AIDS therapy, where it was years in before it was accessible to everyone. I think this is going to be another example where the industry is going to be held to a very high and a very appropriate standard.
That's a great point. And I mean, there's good news. And the good news is, for instance, the flu vaccine, which is 1.5 billion doses a year, is you don't stand a chance if that vaccine costs you more than $1 to make. So that's where, and I think that is the pinch point, is $1. So we got to make sure that we can provide whatever vaccine we come up with for $1 or less.
So I'm glad you
bring George's point is right. Those discussions are happening, you know, as we speak, as we start to try and get the supply chains organized. It's how do you distribute it? Where does it go? Who gets it? And the ethics and the other things around that are hot topics being discussed as we speak.
I mean, if you read The Economist or any of these papers, actually, that's one of the things is, you know, for instance, China's, you know, let's say China comes up with a vaccine first, with a commercially available vaccine. Are they going to want to supply China first, or do they supply the world? Who gets first dibs on this? It's a really great ethical question, actually.
Yep.
And similarly,
answer.
Are we seeing competition from individual companies who want vaccine production done in their countries? I mean, I think it touches on the access issue. That also touches on supply chain. We're seeing some interesting stuff coming out of the U.S. government around countries who will be provided vaccines first, but from the manufacturability standpoint, are we seeing different countries raising their hands saying, hey, we would like to be at the front lines of production?
I think what we've seen is, you know, the concerns firstly would be around shipments. Can you ship things with the borders closed? Will be restricted that way? And that was one concern that came up early on. I think it's probably not as much of a concern now, but there was that concern in terms of, you know, can you move things around? What happens if you can't move things? That was first. Second, in terms of countries competing, most countries are really just saying, how can I help? As far as what we've seen is, you know, what can we do? How do we participate? You know, where does that come from? We haven't seen yet the competition element. We're cautious of it, but we haven't seen it really show too much. It's really been, as the countries come forward, they go, we want to participate, we want to be part of the solution.
Agreed.
Great, thank you. One of you had mentioned the role of CDMOs within the supply chain and in the manufacturability and getting access to the vaccines. What are the opportunities that you see for CDMOs to get involved? Are there contract organizations out there equipped to react quickly to bring a treatment quickly to market? For example, could a biomanufacturing contract manufacturer repurpose, say, a monoclonal antibody purification asset to the purification of plasma-derived immunoglobulin? I'm curious where you see the CMO opportunities to lie.
I'll go ahead, because we are working with several CMOs, and that's been because of the speed of what we can bring to bear quickly. That's been our primary focus to begin with, and we've been able to locate some. Some have had BARDA funding in the past. I don't really know the ins and outs of it, but we know some of the ones we've talked to and some of the ones that we're trying to work with have had some form of funding in the past. They had available capacity. That's not always the case. A lot of the CMOs are going to be full, and then again, you have that, you put off treatments. You can't really stop treatments for other patients to do this. So it's finding that open capacity and that capability, whether it's the BSL-2 type capability that's can be rare to find. But I think there are some CMOs out there that are pretty well equipped to come fast. So and we're trying to work with those at the moment. Not all of them, but there's some out there that are quick. But I think that's something that may have to in the future, where people might have to be set up to address this quicker. That would be one arm that would be important.
I agree with Steve on that one. Obviously, I'm working with a lot of CDMOs. One of the things that I found in my working with the multinationals or working with the CDMOs, et cetera, is the CDMOs tend to be a little quicker. They have fewer constraints in terms of being able to mobilize quickly and being able to, there's less hierarchy, if you want, and they're able to react much more quickly, and their personnel seem to be more adept at adapting to new opportunities or new platforms or new because they're doing it all the time. I mean, you take a company like Lonza or Fuji or any of these companies, they have different clients in there every month. And so they have to adapt to not only manufacturing a drug or biologic, but they have to be able to do it a la, I'll just name some companies, a la Takeda, a la J&J, a la Merck, and they have to adapt to those different philosophies for each one of their manufacturing campaigns. So their ability to adapt, in terms of a new platform or a new manufacturing campaign is, I think it's part of who they are. So it's just easier for them.
Yeah, I would agree. The one area, though, that I do think is an opportunity is troubleshooting. When there is an issue, that relationship with the CDMO is critical in terms of resolving that quickly and moving on. Making sure that the company that they're working with is intimately involved with that process and with the solution going forward.
Great.
I guess another aspect that it relates to the regular life as well, but with the CDMOs, as we start to initiate tech transfers, to Mark's point, they are very flexible and they're used to a lot of different people. But if we were not capable of all this WebExing and video interacting to try and do this tech transfer while in a lockdown, we would be at a dead stop.
Forget it.
We are able to do quite a bit of tech transfer work, knowledge transfer for the process remotely, and without that, we would be at a dead standstill. So this really is helpful.
Steve.
However, and here's where I do think we are really privileged to be in this industry, because if you look across the world in any of the shelter in place and stay at home mandates that have come out, whether they be local, statewide, regional, national, there are exemptions for essential industries and essential work. And where I'm based in Massachusetts at Takeda, not only is pharmaceutical manufacturing considered essential, but pharmaceutical R&D. And so we have to apply the right protections for our people, but we do have flexibility in those cases where we do need to be there in person, with the right protections, because we're considered essential. And we don't take advantage of that. We use that very carefully, but it's an awfully privileged position to be in.
It
Sure.
absolutely is. And just to give you an idea of how, back on Steve's point, how important it is. I mean, I'm literally on a plane every week, and I'm going to different sites all over the world. And obviously that came to a stop in the middle of March, actually near the end of March. I was probably one of the last guys. In fact, there were 6 people on the plane when I flew back from the CDMO. And but I got to tell you, since that time, I don't think I've missed a beat. Like, because of our capabilities, as Steve is mentioning, we haven't missed a beat. Now, the comment from the CDMO was, because I was reluctant at first, I didn't want to go to the airport. I didn't want to go, I didn't want to get on a plane at that point, because everyone was stay home, et cetera. And I was like adamant, do you really need to have me there in person? It was like, yeah. And one of the comments they made is, this whole facility is HEPA filtered. It's probably the safest environment that you're going to be in the next, 2 to 3 months. And so it was kind of a joke, but there was some seriousness there. And of course, when I flew back, I was one of, are you okay with that cough?
Yeah, I'm just fine.
Thought I missed that, didn't you?
I didn't know where the mute button was.
But when I flew back, I realized I was one of 6 people, and they were wiping down the seats and everything else. And I figured, you know what? I was probably safer here than at my neighbor's house, who has their kids coming over, and we're still throwing footballs and frisbees to each other. And I was probably safer on that flight to the Midwest than I was, staying at my own home. So, but the AV, the audiovisual capabilities of today are just amazing. And I bet you Zoom and GoToMeeting, et cetera, are probably making a fortune right now. So.
Yep. We will eventually, of course, have to go there in person, to George's point, to get these tech transfers complete. But we can do we're able to do an awful lot of the upfront work and transfer work. So that's been a big help for us.
And I'm curious, for so long we've operated under sort of a geographic hub-centric model, right? We talk about the Boston-Cambridge hub, we talk about the San Francisco Bay Area hub, talk about these different biotech hubs where that geographic proximity allows certain collaborations and the ability to work closer. I'm wondering if now we've sort of broken down some of those geographic boundaries, and so perhaps is this current environment giving us new collaboration opportunities where it's not so geographically centric. So again, we talk about closeness and willingness to collaborate because we're all part of the same area, but can we move beyond that now because we're all operating in a remote environment?
Here's where I do separate out R&D, because R&D at every company is global. When you run your clinical trials, you have to have representative populations from around the world. You can't bring a product to market if you just stay in one region. And so the operating model for drug development at all companies is global. That being said, it still has its regional contributions. I think we may not leverage that as much as we should. The fact that this global pandemic began in China really challenged us to work differently, because we usually generate things and start things from our global hub in Boston. Now we are using our team in China, based in Shanghai and based in Osaka, as guides for the rest of the world as we navigate this pandemic. So it's really challenged us to think and work differently than we have in the past.
Yeah, I would say certainly the geographic nature, it hasn't impacted us. Wherever we can find people to collaborate with, it's been easy, and maybe that has been even encouraged by the lockdown and the extended use of video conferencing. It really hasn't presented any boundaries, and it's allowed us to just ignore that the geographics almost.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I know that there have been a few very popular or highly publicized programs in the media. I'm thinking about Gilead's remdesivir. I'm thinking about Moderna's messenger RNA-based vaccine. Are there other companies out there who need to be talked about that are working on vaccines and treatments? And along those lines, does it make more sense to sort of get out there and wave your flag, as it were, and say, hey, we're working on this, or quietly focus on completing the work and then announce your findings when you've got something substantial to talk about?
Well, I'm not going to touch that one. Go
Yeah, I was
ahead, Julie.
going to say, this is driven by corporate strategy. Just there are a lot of things, and it's usually not a matter of whether or not a company wants to, but is it aligned with what their corporate strategy is? Is it the right thing to do? What is gained by doing that? And every company approaches that totally differently. Again, Takeda is a Japanese company led by a gentleman from France. We truly are a global company at this point, but we may take a very, very different approach than a company headquartered in New Brunswick, New Jersey, or somewhere else. It's up to each company to make that decision.
So I participate on the Biopharma ASME VPE and the ISP, again, in the spirit of collaboration. And I mean, there's been a lot of things, many personal initiatives that I've just chosen to share with the industry in terms of here's how we can do it better. And I'm a firm believer in ideas generate ideas. Now, of course, there's exceptions to that. And of course, if you've got a proprietary product, for God's sakes, at some point, these companies need to make money too. But in this situation, again, ideas generate ideas. And one of the comments that you talked about before, some of the candidates that are out there, again, one of the things that it gets back to the COVID, the N95 masks, et cetera, and some of the ideas is I think sometimes we've got to take a step back or get back up to 30,000 or 40,000 feet and ask ourselves, what are we really trying to achieve? And one of the things, for instance, on some of those opportunities for vaccines is, as an example, there's no DNA vaccine that's ever been licensed. And so that's going to be a bit more of a hurdle, if we want to get a vaccine out in the next 6 months, because it's something that doesn't have a proven platform technology. So it's something that we need to think about. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying be careful, because the timeline may look very differently. On the N95 mask situation, for instance, the idea of me wearing Steve's or Georgia's mask doesn't appeal to me. And so if you're sending their masks into a centralized area for decontamination, I'm sorry, there's a part of me that just doesn't want to put on somebody else's pants. And a mask would be even more personal. And so when we start thinking about these opportunities, and of course, there was $500 million that was awarded for this. And when we start thinking about some of these things, I'm thinking we should have thought of something that was more personal. I have my mask, I need to decontaminate it. I can put it into a black box, and 3 minutes later, I can put my mask back on. How do we achieve that? And there are technologies that would allow us to do that. But again, sometimes we're jumping a little bit too quickly on some of these. And I know I'm going off in a tangent here, but it gets back to, if it wasn't for the discussion on the VHP of these masks, other potential ideas on how to ensure that we've got good supply chain for these masks may not be generated. And so sharing, I think, of these ideas and how we're going to manufacture vaccines, et cetera, because it's not only about vaccines here, about treatments, IgG, et cetera. The more that we can share, the better, at least at this point, because this is truly a race, for mankind.
Mark, you bring up a great point, because right now, I know with Takeda, and I'm sure with every company, we're already thinking about what that return to work strategy is. What does it mean to have employees come back to their laboratories, to their offices, to their manufacturing locations? What are we going to require? What is optional? What's mandated by your state or your country or your region? And if it is masks, if it is testing, we have to have the infrastructure in place in order to meet those needs. And so I agree with you. Having lots of options on the table is the best way to go.
Yeah.
So with 10 minutes to go, I want to make sure I have time to get to some of the highly voted audience questions. So one of our top voted questions is asking about whether this current environment we're in will create a trend of pharma production returning to the US from other countries, or will the previous reasons for offshoring production still hold true?
I'm not touching that one.
I'll take a shot at that one. I think that the reasons will still be there. I think we've globalized the supply chains so much over the years. You know, when we were discussing our issues for the COVID vaccine, you know, just in terms of vials, there's very little vial capacity in the United States. And then when we talked with BARDA, we said, you know, we're going to be bringing vials in over the border. Nothing's going to change that. But I also think that the shipping and the decontamination is there for that sort of thing. But in terms of you know, regionalizing things again, I wouldn't see that happening. It would be expensive. It would be difficult. I just don't see that as being practical, frankly. That's just really my opinion. That's not a company opinion. That's just my opinion.
You know, I'll share my opinion from an R&D point of view, and again, it's my opinion, not Takeda's, and that is, I don't see an immediate retrenchment or shift, but what I do see is companies being much more thoughtful about what's critical for them, finding that right balance in terms of keeping some capacity in the US and maybe other locations, a better balance. I do think this will cause companies to make decisions differently, consider different factors. At the same time, we also have to be prepared that if we have requirements that are imposed upon us by government to ensure that we have certain essential manufacturing capacity or the ability to supply certain essential items, we may have to respond to that, whether or not we want to, whether or not there's a cost or a price differential in there. So I do think there is going to be some reassessment. You know, what's going to drive it, where we're going to end up, it's anybody's guess.
Thank you. We've talked about BARDA a little bit. We've talked about them taking a role in terms of connecting companies with one another. We also know that they've been funneling money to certain firms with programs. Are they taking any more of an active role in the development of vaccines, in taking a hands-on role in advancing those through clinics? I'm curious to see really what are the ins and outs in terms of the level of interaction BARDA is having with our industry at this moment.
So I can speak to some of that anyway. It's been publicly announced, of course, that BARDA has funded quite a bit of the J&J COVID-19 vaccine. So they're putting a lot of funding into our development. I don't know that they have any hands-on direct activity, but they're certainly monitoring our progress. They're certainly offering to help where they can. When we talk about then building a supply chain element, they're very interested in, you know, where our supplies are coming from, what we can do. If we're finding shortages, they've expressed the ability to go in and work with the other manufacturers, raw material suppliers, component suppliers, to drive solutions to those problems. We haven't had to call them in on any of those at this point, but they've been, you know, interested and active and willing to participate in those discussions. So they are involved. I would say, you know, hands-on in the clinical trials might be a strong statement, but they certainly are monitoring progress. They're certainly, you know, getting reads on the data and things like that, as well as the supply chain help that I mentioned. So they're definitely actively involved in making sure that we can get the supply chain up, that we can deliver the doses that we need to deliver.
Yeah, thank you for that insight, Steve. This next question that I want to ask, which is one that has gotten a few votes, and I think this is going to be our last question as well, since we're coming up on 5 till, is we've partially answered this already regarding BARDA funding, but we're talking about a lot of money here. All of this isn't unanticipated large-scale R&D manufacturing of products as a response to the pandemic beyond Uncle Sam, where's all this money going to come from?
In reality, it's pennies. The cost of the economy is trillions. The cost of these facilities is millions. It's almost a non-factor.
Thank you, Mark. I couldn't agree more. And I'd also like to say that right now, the cost is really not even coming into the discussion. What's coming into discussion is how quick, how safe can we move therapies through?
Exactly.
You know, the cost piece is something that, you know, if something is brought forward to prevent, you know, 250,000 deaths and position us for what we know will be a future pandemic, there really is no ability to put a cost on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would second George's comments. There's really no concern on the cost. It is the speed. It's how quickly you can get it. And I know that we've announced from at least from our intention would be, you know, not-for-profit supplies during the pandemic, so that it's clearly just getting the doses, getting the cures out to the folks, out to the people, and not worrying about the cost.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting. I just want to make one more comment. And again, this is my own opinion. This is what sometimes gives the industry a bit of a bad name because, you know, people always challenge us. So you're more worried about profits and you're more worried about cost as opposed to access for every single person that needs the therapy. And I realize that this is a practical question. So, but we have to, you know, think about that this is sometimes how people see our industry and what we have to get past. Because, you know, what you've heard from the three panelists here is first and foremost, safety, bringing therapies forward, speed, you know, and contributing to solving, you know, this pandemic, and that's the messaging that this industry should be bringing forward and should be known for.
Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. That's
Well,
that's the best summary we could have, Georgia. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to agree as well. I've been very heartened to hear most of the conversations with the decision makers within industry saying exactly what you said, Georgia. We're not even thinking about cost right now. We're just focused solely on getting treatments to patients. And so I think that's why we're all in the industry, and that's why we're all here. So on that note, which I think is the perfect way to end this webinar, I want to thank our speakers for sharing all of your thoughts and your expertise. My apologies for the minor technical difficulties in the beginning, but again, this is the world of working from home. And I want to thank everyone who joined today's webinar for your interest and support of the ISPE Boston Area Chapter educational programming. You'll receive a follow-up email with a short survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback. You'll also receive an email with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. So on the behalf of ISPE Boston and our presenters, I want to thank you again for joining us today. And thank you to our dedicated sponsors, DPS Group, ICQ Consultants, and Massey Bioservices, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you,
Steve.
everybody.
Thanks, Georgia.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye now.